One of the ideas I'm very interested in is how we view knowledge and how that has changed over time. Because knowledge management has been through really 3 periods of time. Each time how we think about knowledge has changed, and each time how we think about who has valuable knowledge has changed. So I want to draw those 3 times for you. The first time we heard the term knowledge management was about 1995. So I'll call that the first era of knowledge management. But there had been many things happening before that where people were beginning to think about the learning in organizations. There was action learning that Reg Revens had created. There was organizational learning, and in fact I published a book about organizational learning right about 1995. We were already trying to think about learning was not just individual, but it was a system, even that early. In the 1950s and the 1960s, Peter Drucker had begun to write books about how things were changing in the world of economics and business. And he wrote a book called The Post-Capitalistic Society. And by that he meant that capital, as we normally thought of it, that is capital in land, capital in sense of money, or even capital in sense of labor, was no longer going to be the most important thing that organizations had to deal with. That in a post-capitalistic society, it was knowledge that was the most important asset they would have. And he had been writing this for a number of years, and finally the people in organizations began to hear that. It takes quite a long for things to get from the university into the field of business. Around 1995, people began to say to themselves, knowledge is really important. We need to do something about our knowledge. And because they had been thinking about it as an asset in the same way knowledge, in the same way capital was or property was, the idea they had was, let's see if we can manage it by bringing it all together. So this era I'm going to call the information age. So people talked about this as knowledge management, but when I look back on it, I see that it was primarily information management. What happened in this first era was that people had in their minds something like a warehouse or a library. And the idea was, we'll get all the knowledge that's in the organization, we'll put it all in a big repository, and then whenever someone needs it, they can come in and get it. Now this was quite a good idea because before that knowledge was scattered all over the organization. So the idea was quite clever to say, let's put it someplace where people can get it. It also meant then that rather than having to go to training to learn it, you could get it when you needed it. So it was a very good idea. So organizations begin to build these large repositories. They put the policy of the company in there, they put the standard operating procedures, they put requirements for things, and they begin to put lessons learned in there and best practice in there because they wanted all the information. So they would bring together groups of experts and say, give us the best practice about an area. And the experts would write that all out, and that would get put into this database as well. So this very good idea about people put things in and then anyone can come and get it out at any time, that idea turned out not to work as well as the people had hoped that it would work. What they discovered was that it was very difficult for the experts to keep this knowledge up to date. And they also discovered that people tended to not come in and find what they needed. You remember during this time that search was not very sophisticated. So the search engines weren't too good. And people found that if they went in to try to find something, they often couldn't find something that was useful to them. Or if they did find it, very often they would have to read quite a long document, and then maybe only a very small portion of it was useful. When managers discovered that people were not coming in and getting knowledge like they thought they would, and they were in fact not putting in knowledge like they thought they would, they decided, well, what we're going to have to do is reward it, incentivize it. And so different organizations tried some very funny things to do. Some offered candy bars every time you put something in the data bank. One clever organization gave frequent flyer points. But none of these systems worked very well. It did not encourage people, because if you say, put more knowledge in, I can put that knowledge in, but it doesn't have to be useful knowledge. So just rewarding putting in didn't turn out to be very useful. So when rewarding didn't work very well, then some organizations said, well, we will mandate it. We will mandate that you have to put 3 lessons in every month, or that you have to look at all the lessons learned and search them before you start a new project. That turned out not to work very well either. People did what was mandated, but it didn't help them very much because the knowledge was not in there that they really needed. Much that had been driving this information management were the large consulting firms like Ernst & Young or IBM. And they saw a very good opportunity here to put in these repositories. They had the skills and the knowledge. So many companies spent millions of dollars to the consulting firms. In fact, early on, if you said you have knowledge management, the response was, yes, we've put in a system, a repository. And people said, okay, that's knowledge management. So when it turned out that these big information systems, these big repositories did not work, then the big consulting businesses left the field of knowledge management, and we began to hear many articles saying that knowledge management was dead, that it was over. But at the same time, a very new idea was growing. And that new idea came from a couple of places. I'll put that new idea up here, and that new idea was experience management. And this was the time that the World Wide Web was now very active. And you could talk to people around the world. And that made a new kind of knowledge management possible. And that was that peers could join together and talk to each other and learn from each other. Now that wasn't a new idea in the whole world of learning, because Reg Revans had had that idea very early. But the World Wide Web made this possible for companies that had now gone global to put in a different kind of knowledge management. So around 2000, a very important book was written by a man named Eotine Winger. And he was an anthropologist, and he studied how groups learn from each other and wrote a very important book. And he wound up calling that book Communities of Practice. And by that he meant people who all did the same work had a way of learning from each other. So what was happening here was that people began to think the knowledge that is in repositories is the explicit knowledge we have. But there is a great deal of knowledge that is in our heads, which we call tacit knowledge. And that explicit knowledge was only a very small part of the knowledge that people had. That perhaps the most important part of that knowledge they had was in their heads and could not be written down. The reason it could not be written down is because of the way our brains work and the way we store knowledge. We have experiences, and those experiences that we have at work are stored in small bits all across our brain. And when we face a problem, an issue we have not faced before, or a difficulty, we draw on all those little bits of knowledge and we put them together to make a solution. That solution may be a solution we've never thought of before, but the problem itself draws that knowledge together that we have and creates a new idea for us. The same thing happens when someone asks us a question. It's a question we haven't ever tried to answer before, but again, we draw on those bits of knowledge and put it together. So we don't actually know something until we begin to put our knowledge together to solve a problem or to answer a question. So we begin to try to think about how can teams learn, how can projects learn. And we realized that what has to happen there is the people who are on the project, who are on the team, they need to come together and they need to talk together about what they've been learning. So we begin to build processes like learning before, learning during, and learning after. And all of these are processes where groups come together and think together about what have we just done, what did we learn from that, what do we need to do different. So all of these processes we begin to say are conversation processes. Now again, around 2005, a new idea began to grow. This was just the beginnings of it. And I'm going to call this one idea management. And again, a new technology had come along. This was Web 2.0. And it enabled some new things to do with knowledge that we had not done before. So idea management is about three big ideas. One is the idea that people who are at the bottom of the organization often have very good innovation ideas. But the question is always how to get them to the top, those ideas. Because this had been primarily, this section in here had primarily been about people at the bottom of the hierarchy. I'll just draw a hierarchy here. And I won't draw it all the way down. But this had been about knowledge moving this way at the bottom of the hierarchy. Workers on the front line learning from each other. In this era, nor in this era, did we have knowledge that was going up or going down. That part of knowledge we had not given thought to. But now around 2005, that became possible. With the help of Web 2.0, it was possible to put together processes like Innocentive or IBM's Idea Jam, Innovation Jam, where people at the bottom of the organization could raise their idea up and make it visible, and people at the top of the organization could hear it and get the idea of it. And so we created much more innovation. Very many ideas now can come from the bottom. The second big idea was that organizations have many problems that are long-standing that they've not been able to solve. For example, one problem might be that we do not retain employees very well. We hire new employees, we train them, and then as soon as we get them trained and they start working, they go off to some other company. That's a very big problem for some organizations. Another big problem sometimes organizations have is around quality. We've been working on quality. No matter what we do, we can't get quality fixed. We try this, we try that, we still don't get it fixed. Now the idea has been there are people inside the organization. If we could get the collective knowledge of the organization working on that problem, we could solve it. So their ideas grew up. Besides the ideas that were technology-based, there were ideas about how do you bring the whole organization together to work on a problem. And that's an idea that comes from this era. The third big issue was the idea of strategy. Always strategy has been something that the people at the very top of the organization do. But again, we know that the collective wisdom of the organization is smarter than any small group of people. So the saying is that all of us are smarter than a few of us. So organizations have begun to involve the whole of the organization in building the strategy, and doing that again through some of these new processes like appreciative inquiry or open space technology. Those kinds of ideas allow us to draw on the collective knowledge of the organization. So this era now begins to say people in the organization not only have knowledge that's useful, they have a capability of analyzing that knowledge. They have a sense-making capability that is also critical. So we have moved from thinking that knowledge is that which is written down to also saying we also need this knowledge that is in our heads, to saying we also need to have the sense-making capability of the whole of the organization. So that's a huge change from the beginning to the end. At the same time, we've begun to think about new ways to think about knowledge and learning. Each of these also has grown. So information management is still something very important that organizations need. And search engines, as we've gone through 2000, 2005, search engines have gotten much better. So it's very possible now for people to go in and find things inside information management. We've also learned better ways to organize that information, to synthesize it so people don't have to look at very large compilations of documents. That knowledge is synthesized for them. So we're doing a very much better job here. This also has grown over time. And even though we're now thinking about this piece is getting better as well. There are more and more ways that people think of to get the knowledge from people's heads and to make that knowledge flow across the organization. And of course, we're just beginning to learn how to use the collective knowledge of the organization. So again, there were people writing about this idea before it was taken up by the organizations. One book that was written by Sir Wiki was called The Wisdom of Crowds, and it explained how often a crowd can make better decisions than even the smartest individual can. There was another quite good book called The Difference, which talked about the value of cognitive diversity, that if you want to solve a problem, you can't keep just a group that's homogeneous together. You need to bring in the diversity of thinking to solve it. So we're learning how to do this. We're also learning more about how to do communities and how to do learning before, during, and after. For example, when we first started communities, we didn't know that they needed a facilitator. So many of the first communities were interesting, but they didn't add value to the organization. But as we worked through this, we discovered that communities need to be sponsored by somebody high in the organization, they need to have a business focus, and they need to be facilitated if they're going to bring value to the organization. So in the 20 years that knowledge management has been working, we have learned a great deal about how to continually add more knowledge to the organization, to bring more value to the organization. We started out thinking that knowledge was about expert knowledge. Then we began to understand that peers also have knowledge. And then finally we've come to the understanding that the whole organization, the collective, has knowledge. We started here to think about explicit knowledge, that knowledge you could write down. And then we began to think about the knowledge that was in people's heads. And here we begin to think about other abilities that people have to actually make sense of the knowledge. And that's also an important issue. The final thing that I might say about it is that when organizations start knowledge management, very often the first idea that comes into their heads is this same idea that we all started with, which is that we need to collect all the information. And that's quite a sensible way to start. The problem is that we have learned over the years that it's not enough. But sometimes organizations have to learn that for themselves. They have to find out that if we put in information management, we still don't have the knowledge that we need. And then they will move on to putting in experience management. And then finally they will come to collective knowledge.